My name's Tim Duffy. I'm a Vice Chair of the Lothians Group of the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and I say good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen, Scottish Wildlife Trust members and supporters. Every group around Scotland organises events and talks, and tonight we are lucky to have this talk hosted centrally so that people can see a recording of this later, and a much wider audience tends to attend. I want to thank everybody who's donated through the Eventbrite booking system. That money will go to the Lothians Group and help us organise walks, talks, do our planning work and reserve management work in the interests of the Scottish Wildlife Trust in the Lothians. I said I'm a Vice Chair of the Lothians Group. Last September, I finished 30 years as a Trustee of the Trust, and that's where I met tonight's speaker, relatively recently become a Trustee, and a very knowledgeable and wide-ranging career that Dr. Julian Caldecott has had. He has worked from Indonesia to Sri Lanka to Nepal, and most recently doing studies around the world for the Finnish government to do with aid programs, sustainability, the environment, and he has written several books on climate chaos and climate change and that sort of thing. And he's currently writing a book called Restoring Peace with Nature. And that, of course, is the title of his talk. Julian has about 20 slides and he'll talk for a good half an hour or more. And after that, it is my role to try and put to him the questions that you have put into the Q&A chat line, not the chat line, but the Q&A chat line. And we will have lots of time for that. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Julian and ask him to share his PowerPoint with us.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's great. Shall I just share the thing and then start talking, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh. Right. Good. Well, great. That's thank you very much to Jill and Tim for that, and thanks for attending. Wish I could meet you all, but this is one way at the moment. But I look forward to your questions later on. So as Tim said, I'm Julian Caldecott. I'm an ecologist. I sometimes call myself or think of myself as an Earth systems ecologist because my work increasingly involves paying more and more attention to ecological changes that are affecting the whole world and what to do about them. So my career, essentially, I started off focused on particular species, monkeys, elephants, so forth in rainforests, and then it got bigger and bigger, became to do with national parks and then sustainable development planning and biodiversity and so forth. So, and now climate change is very much on the agenda for my work. But in the process, basically, I've been working with indigenous peoples and nature conservation, mainly in the tropics, since the 70s. So that dates me. But anyway, I settled in Scotland about 5 years ago. I have to say, the country's paradise. I'm now in my second 3-year term. I just started my second 3-year term as a trustee of the Scottish Wildlife Trust. I do need to say, though, that my talk today is entirely personal and doesn't reflect Wildlife Trust policy in any way. It's also a big picture view with sort of think global, act local being the theme. So I got interested in peace with nature in Costa Rica in the early 1990s. Their approach was to take a kind of multi-decadal view and use cutting-edge science and economic incentives to guide society towards nature restoration and sustainability. Now, peace with nature later became Costa Rican government national policy, and since then, since the mid-2000s, it's become very influential and inspired the world, and especially the United Nations. So what you're seeing on screen now is some quotes from the United Nations Secretary-General António Guterres, which he said last year. He's been making similar comments for several years now. He's in a good position to know an awful lot about the state of the world because the UN does a lot of research and there are many experts involved, and it all that knowledge aggregates up at the Secretary-General level, who then tries to communicate with governments. And as you can see, he's very much on side here. He's talking about nature. Nature is life we're waging a war against nature, a war that we can't win because there can be no winner. Every year we see temperatures climbing on average. Every year we lose more species, of course. And he sees this increasingly as an existential crisis, and I'm afraid that is how I see it as well. So there'll be some of that later on. But as Guterres says, making peace with nature he sees as the defining task of the 21st century. So an existential crisis, of course, is one that we may not survive as a species or a civilization. So he sees it as extremely dangerous and urgent. The essential message here is that nature is much more powerful than we are. We should treat her with respect and be much more careful, or else. So the question is, how did we get into this pickle? You know, the Earth is huge and doing so much damage to it, to the point where the UN is talking about an existential crisis, would have taken a long time. My estimate is it took the last 600 years. But to give you a bit of background to explain that, the way I see it, basically about 6 centuries ago, this was the 1420s, the start of what would become the Age of Discovery. Europeans had been basically fighting each other and fighting Islam in the Crusades and so forth for a long time. They were battle hardened and thinking of war, and they developed the technology, the ships, the guns and steel, and were about to get out of Europe, which they then did. Basically, initially the Portuguese and the Spaniards, and there's a whole story of the rapid expansion of the European peoples, heavily armed and looking for wealth and trouble and slaves and all the rest of it. When they started exploring and expanding around the world, they found the world full of indigenous people who weren't thinking like that at all. They were living in peace, more or less at peace with nature in their homelands. But the Europeans saw these peoples and their homelands as ripe for exploitation, and they saw nature as an infinite resource. And that's an idea that's still alive and kicking these days. But the net result of this was a 600-year onslaught, during which ecosystems and indigenous peoples were destroyed on a colossal scale. And that's the process that's led to the existential crisis we're facing now. Signs of that crisis include things like the recent weather disasters, which I'm sure we can easily remember, the named storms and hurricanes that just keep on coming, the tragic wildfires recently in Hawaii and Greece, in Los Angeles, and the catastrophic floods in California, the Gulf, Central Europe and Spain in the last couple of years. Disasters like this killed lots and lots of people and cost economically some $320 billion US in 2024 alone. And as the world's largest reinsurance company says, this is Munich Re, this year, they said climate change is showing its claws. And I guess that's true. But I suppose, you know, disasters are just the most extreme signs of something deeper going on. This is a diagram put together by the Stockholm Resilience Centre that's been working on Earth system boundaries for many years, well, since 2009, I think, when it started. But what they've done here is they've assembled information about 9 Earth system boundaries, which are the sort of, the dimensions of environmental integrity or the health of nature. These are the ones that they know about enough to put in this diagram, at least. As you can see, there's a sort of green blob in the middle there, which represents the safe operating space for humanity. There are 9 segments coming out of that. The orange ones are where essentially all the evidence suggests that we're well beyond the safe limits. And we've broken through these boundaries and we're pushing outwards into an unknown and an increasingly dangerous future. So the further we get away from the green, the darker the red, the more the risk is. And as you can see, the climate change, the integrity of the biosphere, land systems change, fresh water, these are all dimensions here. Actually, in fact, there are an awful lot more than 9 boundaries like this, I'm sure. These are just the ones we know about enough, or we know enough about to define, to put in this diagram. In fact, a 10th was discovered just last year, actually. Aquatic oxygen depletion was its definition. But in any case, the point is that our species has planetary impacts and planetary responsibilities. And peace with nature ultimately has to be about getting back retreating back within that green safe space. Somehow that has to be achieved. That's vital, but with so many different dimensions to it, it isn't going to be a simple matter. But I guess you could say that if enough of us wanted to be at peace with nature, we could be. So the key question really is, why don't enough of us want to? And that's a question about the feelings, thoughts, and motivations that shape our collective actions. So as Tim mentioned, I'm writing a book about restoring peace with nature, which involves looking closely at the thinking that goes on about it. So I see it as almost a question of how human mindsets drive our relationship with the natural world. In any case, I'm pursuing the thought that there are 4 basic kinds of thinking about, or strands of peace with nature thinking that I've been exploring so far. The first is the scientific and technological position, which is the strand, which is the United Nations kind of idea of clean, green, democratic, sustainable development. This is the one that is close to my own heart, since I was sort of trained in that way of thinking through my conservation work. And it's a perfectly rational point of view. It sort of essentially argues that, or expects or hopes that all environmental problems can be solved with knowledge and reason, that all treaties and national laws are respected and complied with, that public and private sectors and civil society will all work together, that economic incentives will be used to nudge all actors towards ecological outcomes, that intergenerational justice can be worked out and taken seriously. Those are the kind of things that Costa Rica pioneered, and it is tantalizingly close in quite a lot of cities, well, locations, put it that way, 1 or 2 countries and a number of cities around the world. So it can be done. On the other hand, it's not dominantly driving the human condition just now. It's a kind of an ideal. However, another strand here is the religious and spiritual strand. So many of us feel a deep affinity for nature, a sense of divine consciousness that permeates the universe, compassion for all beings, and awed respect for Mother Earth. As a result, leaders of all the major faith and philosophy traditions, from the Pope to the Dalai Lama, have spoken out against ecological degradation. So there's that going on. It could be more or less powerful, influential in different countries. The third strand I want to mention is the community activism strand, which is about essentially our world is made up of small communities. Even in cities, they're basically small neighborhoods and people who know each other. This reflects the fact that people work best in small groups. Always have done, always will do, I suspect. It's sort of built into the way we do things. But new technologies are now making citizen science and networking amongst these small groups very potent. So community activism is about organizing ourselves to understand our local environment, to agree what we want to happen where we live with our neighbors, and to make it so through visioning, through informed campaigning, networking, appealing to government, business planning, writing grant proposals, whistleblowing, and taking legal or direct action as needed. So there's a whole raft of things that go into community activism. Obviously, there are many, many examples right across Scotland, and the local groups that work with the Scottish Wildlife Trust around in and around many of the nature reserves are an aspect of that. The fourth strand, though, about Indigenous peoples and how they think, I find particularly fascinating and useful to have in mind. So I'll talk a little bit about that because it's not necessarily very obvious to us here. But as I said, I've spent a lot of time with Indigenous people and kind of read a lot of anthropology, and kind of there seems to be I'm seeing a consistent pattern in how they approach nature. It seems to me the pattern is that all peoples who depend closely on nature have laws to protect its integrity. I guess it's common sense because they need to do that. But the fact is that Indigenous peoples all have traditional laws that require living in harmony with the ecosystems and wildlife in their homelands. So, for example, the Penan hunter-gatherers in Borneo have a word, molong, which means to use every resource with care and respect while conserving enough for later. That's as thorough a translation as we can come up with. But this concept of molong is central to their mindset and indeed their entire way of life. They're very integrated into the rainforest and tread very lightly upon it. And you see that their behavior is very much guided by this. And it turns out that every Indigenous people that anyone studied essentially has a concept like it. Couple of examples, Sumakamanya in the Bolivian Aymara language means living well through sustainability, spirituality, community, cooperation, and lawful respect for Mother Earth, or Pachamama, as they call her. Or we could go to the other side of the world, and the Aboriginal Australian Ngangrinman language, they have a word called the word punyu, which means living in the fullness of life while promoting the physical, mental, social, and spiritual health of people, nature, country, and world. These are sophisticated, deep concepts that these people have got a word for and just use it and live by it, and that's how they survive. That's how it works. And because of this universality of Indigenous thinking, well, essentially, for shorthand, I just call it the Molong mindset. And it's very, very different to the modern cosmopolitan mindset of the global mainstream, which, for better or worse, we're all more or less inhabiting. I guess the point is ultimately that if you live dependent on nature, then you have to have a Molong mindset, or you won't live very long, or you have to move on somewhere else. But from this point of view, we people of the global mainstream have a serious dilemma, because we depend on nature, but we've forgotten the Molong mindset. So we're therefore destroying our own resources. I guess we lost our way on this since that European Age of Discovery that I mentioned earlier in the 1400s. And in the subsequent 600 years, you saw the creation of the modern world, the rise of the global mainstream culture, and the destruction of most Indigenous ways of life. In that process, we kind of forgot the Molong mindset, forgot the way of Molong. And that's got us into serious problems. I would say that making peace with nature, therefore, has to involve reclaiming something like the Molong mindset, has to involve remembering how to think like Indigenous people, at least to some extent, and starting to act accordingly. This sounds hard, but I think there are good reasons to be optimistic. I mean, we know we can do it. After all, humans settled the entire world, or most of the world, on foot and raft, I guess, over 100,000+ years before the modern era. And they must have done it by expanding into new areas and then settling there and learning how to live there sustainably and then expanding later on. So the whole human history must involve sort of brief conquest periods with long periods of Molong. And I think that suggests we probably have two different mindsets at work in amongst people. So essentially, we've forgotten one, we need to reactivate it in order to achieve peace with nature. In any case, we'll come back to that sort of thing later on, but these four strands of thinking kind of need to be, they're all parts of the answer, and they're not, none of them is complete in all circumstances. They have to be braided together and adapted to make sense in any given location, each situation, and also often communicated to engage people through the arts, through storytelling, through poetry, through music and film, to communicate these things. I believe, and I think can demonstrate, that people all over the world are actively involved in working in various ways to restore peace with nature, but often without using that precise term. They're all using one of these strands, one or more of these strands of thought, though. And I see Scotland as close to the forefront of this movement, with community activism, art, spirit, and science all pushing in the same direction here. So, having looked at that, we can start to think about what is peace with nature? What is this? What does it mean when António Guterres or I talk about it? Well, I think the way I think at the moment is it's a consequence of a society having a Molong mindset. It's people wanting to understand and obey ecological rules. It's a sustainable accommodation between people and life, land, water, and spirit in a place. It's love of life, of knowledge, of homeland, of community, of family, of God, if you like. It's also local accountability of decision makers to those affected by their decisions. It's precaution, seeking assurance that no harm will be done before you act. The more these are integrated into how the society works, the more likely it is to be describable as being at peace with nature. But it's also about being honest, about honesty in relation to survival and real threats, recognition of ecological reality. And it must be said that some big issues must be addressed. So, and that feeds into the answer to the question of why make peace with nature? Why is this an issue? I refer to the broken Earth system boundaries that I mentioned earlier. They're worth taking a closer look at, and I'll do that briefly just to make clear the dangers that we face, essentially. I'll concentrate on a couple of the most obvious ones, the heating and melting of the Arctic and global loss of wildlife. So, excuse me just a moment. Complicated picture, but in its heart quite simple. It shows the concentration of methane and carbon dioxide in the air going back 400,000 years, taken from bubbles of air trapped in the ice in Greenland. Yeah, so they've taken ice cores, they've melted the thing, and they've taken up the air and measured its concentrations, and this shows a sort of rhythmical bobbing through of methane and carbon dioxide and correlation with temperature over the last 400,000 years. In fact, it goes back, a very similar graph would go back 800,000 years as well, which is as far as the ice cores can reach, because then you hit bedrock. But you'll see on the right that there's a sudden set of arrows there that pointing skywards. We're basically both saying that the carbon dioxide and methane have started to skyrocket, and temperature is starting to follow. So up until now, carbon dioxide has been driving most of the global heating that we've observed, because it's much more abundant than methane. You know, we're talking parts per million rather than parts per billion. But methane is about 80 times, or a little more than 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So if there was a situation where as it increases, it becomes more and more important as a driver of global heating. And obviously, if as the world warms up, if it increases the amount of methane released, then that might, we might eventually say that, it's carbon dioxide that was the warm-up act, and it was the methane that's going to do us in. So we need to be quite careful in terms of observing the methane situation, because it is in fact a real threat. As we'll see from this rather neat graph of the volume of sea ice in the Arctic, which goes back to 1979, because that's when we had first reliable combination of depth data from military submarines and area data from satellites, so we could piece it together. But this shows the month by month status of volume of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. The line to watch is the black line in the middle, which shows the minimum, the summer minimum, which sort of declined from about 17,000 cubic kilometers in 1979 to about 4,000 cubic kilometers now, and looks set to approach zero in the early 2030s from this trajectory. The reason why this is a problem is that it takes, again, about 80 times more heat to melt ice than it does to heat water, which means that much of the heat that's been being trapped on Earth by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in this period, since 79, but also earlier, most of that heat has been going into, well, it's been going into the deep ocean, but also into melting ice, which has absorbed a huge amount of heat. When there's no ice left, then of course that heat will be going into the sea, and that will heat the sea up very rapidly. And that is an issue from a point of view of methane, because there are an estimated 2 trillion tons of methane stored frozen in the Arctic seabeds and in permafrost. And some of this is bound to be released as the Arctic melts in the 2030s and 2040s. We don't know how much or how fast, but even if it was 1 billion tons per year, that'd be 80 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, because it's 80 times more potent. Then that would be nearly double the current rate of all human greenhouse gas emissions, and could easily tip the Earth into sort of hothouse conditions, which would be very destructive and could be quite fast. So that's what António Guterres means when he's talking about an existential threat. It's something that we may not survive, and it's coming down the tracks. But looking backwards a little bit more and broadening the perspective about global wildlife abundance, this is the famous chart from World Wildlife Fund, looking at the Living Planet Index, which starts off. It's based on a tracking of a number of a sort of basket of well-studied wildlife populations around the world, in land, in rivers and lakes, and at sea. It started off at 1970 with an index value of 1, and it's been declining ever since. Every few years they publish a new analysis, and based on the population data from the species they're monitoring. The pink area, or the line, is the median, and the pink area is the range of uncertainty around it. You see that the headline is it's gone down 73% since 1970, which is essentially, during my career as a working conservationist, it's that kind of time frame. The decline is actually worst in freshwater, it's bad on land, and least bad in the seas. So that's how it's divided. It looks to me though that like the rate of decline is actually slowing down a bit towards the end here, which could be good news. It might be that the surviving wildlife populations are more concentrated in protected areas. Plus, we're spending maybe more effort on protecting them. We're spending more money on trying to join them up and restore ecosystems in and around protected areas. Maybe this is having an effect at last. In any case, it reminds us that nature, can repair herself if she has half the chance. If we kind of work with her, then things can get better. And we can do an awful lot at the local level with doing those sort of things. But just to just to belabor the point a little bit, we have these global issues that we need to deal with. And these are important as far as our local achievements are concerned. For example, say a nature reserve run by the Scottish Wildlife Trust, however effective we are at conserving it, it's vulnerable to global change. Bigger things can interfere with it. And we need to think in terms of there being one biosphere, one nature, and one humankind. We need global solutions here that can only come from thinking like that. Ultimately, I'm afraid it comes down to the need for sustained public demand for disciplined political leadership to get us back inside those green Earth system boundaries that we saw on the previous chart. Nothing else will do really. But in the process, we need to be asking for and insisting on markets and policies that value early emission cuts and low emission pathways to net zero. We shouldn't be satisfied with just what the market will provide, or where the profits are now, or what's easiest politically. We need to push this quite hard. We also need to insist that the all remaining carbon-rich and biodiversity-rich ecosystems do need to be protected. These are vitally important investments, and we shouldn't be shy of insisting that our leaders embrace that and respond to them. We also need to be sure that someone somewhere is paying attention to all this methane that may well be coming out of the Arctic, the melting Arctic in a few years. Where is the planning for that? Where is the capacity to recapture, 1 billion tons of methane a year from the mid 2030s? These questions are not being asked, and they really should be being asked. And then, of course, we need to meet the biodiversity targets, global biodiversity targets that the international community has agreed. The 30% of everything protected by 2030 and the Kunming-Montreal strategy needs to be insisted upon. So there's quite a to-do list globally, but we need to come back to the local, because local is vital. Yeah, local. Think globally, act locally. That was the slogan or an idea dreamed up by Patrick Geddes, actually, a Scottish biologist, sociologist, and pioneer of urban planning. It was adopted by the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and became the slogan of Agenda 21, and it still applies. Essentially, we have to be aware of the global situation and also act locally in order to influence things. What happens locally and nationally can change things at global level. Word spreads. Examples are infectious and inspiring, and things will happen. So the other thing I want to say is that I think in many areas, not universally, but in many places, the Molong mindset is actually returning. I think people are sensing the approach of dangerous boundaries, and somehow there's an automatic switch over to this other mindset, away from the onslaught mindset towards the Molong mindset. I think that's happening, and I think it explains a lot of what I'll show you in the next couple of slides. But anyway, local activism is always critically important because mindsets are changing. It becomes easier to achieve. Solutions become easier to achieve, easier to network, and easier to replicate. Anyone who cares about the local environment nowadays with technology can find people nearby or online who share their concerns. Local activism is always an option, especially in a small, thoughtful country like Scotland, or any of hundreds of other places around the world. And there are always local improvements to be made, cleaning things up, restoring natural ecosystems, not building on floodplains, reintroducing beavers, planting wildflowers, gathering new ecological knowledge, raising awareness. The list is long, obviously, for everywhere, but everywhere is different. This list will be different for each place, because the world is very diverse and fine-grained. But whatever it involves, the doing this stuff is just becomes easier and easier with public support and a moral mindset, but is otherwise hard to do. That's why I think it's becoming easier. So the question is, how do we make progress here? Now that we know all of that, what should we actually do? Local activism is important since it builds local capacity and agency, as well as feeling good and spreading the word. Encouraging legislators to act in support is also important. This can be done directly or through charities and the lobbying that they can do. The point is, I guess, that legislators need vigorous prodding at times, but sometimes they can surprise us. They can do amazing things. For example, and this is some examples here, just starting rather close to home with Europe and Scotland and Wales. We've got an ongoing campaign to make ecocide an international crime under the Rome statutes, so it would be presided by the International Criminal Court. That's making rapid progress, and I think probably will be achieved in the next couple of years. Meanwhile, though, the EU passed the Environmental Crime Directive last year, which was a major breakthrough in tightening up the ecocide law. And then in Scotland, we have the Ecocide Prevention Scotland Bill that's been put out for consultation fairly recently, and hopefully will move into legislation later this year. Meanwhile, another area of legislative activism is protecting the rights of future generations. Now here there's actually an act in Wales in 2015 that requires future generations to be protected in all government plans and decisions. And it's, as far as I can tell, transformative from the talks I've been to about it. And in parallel with that, recently, there's now a Wellbeing and Sustainable Development in Scotland bill that's been put forward to duplicate some of this Welsh approach here, which is amazing and would be fantastic. Of course, again, it's been out for consultation. We'll see where it goes. So then we move a bit further away from Scotland, Wales, and Europe and to South America and New Zealand, because there's been quite a lot of interesting activity over there. For example, in Ecuador, in the 2008 Constitution and the 2010 law in Bolivia. I'm afraid that's a typo. It should be 2010. Anyway, the law of the rights of Mother Earth. Basically, both of these things recognize the inalienable rights of ecosystems, nature, or Mother Earth, or Pachamama, to exist and to flourish, and require government to remedy any violations of these rights. And they also embody and affirm the indigenous concept of living well in harmony with nature, which was Sumak Kause in Quechua in Ecuador, or Simacamania in Bolivia that I mentioned earlier. And then we've got the interesting examples of recognizing the rights of ecosystems. In Colombia, the Constitutional Court granted rights to this mega diverse river basin back in 2016. And then the New Zealand Parliament has granted legal personhood with human guardians to this rainforest, to river system, and a volcanic mountain in just January this year for the mountain. These are extraordinary developments, and if not in New Zealand, if in New Zealand, why not in Scotland? Is what I say. Just seems to me the more the Molong mindset comes back to us, the less controversial these ideas seem. It's clearly accelerating and becoming spreading and becoming more influential. Even to the point where one might imagine constitutional protections for nature, sort of building on the Ecuadorian concept. I mean, most societies have written constitutions which establish clear rights and guide rails for everyone to live by, and also act as a safeguard against special interests corrupting government, which is an ever-present risk, of course. If a country that had a written peace with nature constitution, that would state that no human law may contribute to violating Earth system boundaries against the principles of ecological sustainability. This seems like a perfectly reasonable position because we can't live outside the safe zone without suffering horribly. So therefore, we need to check that our laws don't encourage us to violate these boundaries more. But if you have a constitution like that, it'd have to be enforced by somebody, and normally you have a supreme or a constitutional court to do that. And in the case of an ecological or piece of nature thing, you probably want a specially trained branch of it to protect that boundary. There are, in fact, proposals for such a constitution in Scotland to cover the devolved powers, that is, land use, environment planning, water, that kind of thing. And if in Scotland, why not in Sweden, the homeland? Well, I mean, sorry, if in Scotland, the homeland of Nan Shepherd and Rabbie Burns, why not in Sweden, the homeland of Greta Thunberg, or Vermont, the homeland of Bernie Sanders? You know, if you start asking these questions, people start thinking, well, maybe why not? Anyway, this is the cutting edge of restoring peace of nature, I guess. There are also an awful lot. I mean, we've covered with legislative activism and imaginative constitutional stuff, but what about just administrations? And again, we're finding examples multiplying around the world of interesting things going on. For example, France, it had a citizens' assembly which recommended, on climate change, which recommended that all civil servants be put through training in the ecological transition to help create an ecological civilization. So the government agreed to that, and they started training in 2022 in putting every civil servant through a three-day course, based on understand, imagine, and act, a three-part course. The aim is to train all 5.6 million civil servants by 2027. It's, you don't read much about this in the British press, but it's an important thing. There's something very similar happening in China as well. And then you have California, for example, last year, the public prosecutor or Attorney General went for ExxonMobil on a big public case against them for essentially lying about the recyclability of plastic and plastic pollution generally. So there's that, but launching a lawsuit like that, 10 years ago would have been laughed at. It's now becoming normal. And then we're seeing a lot of local governments becoming more active in making up shortfalls in national government activism by taking over political leadership to sort of drive things forward at the local level by different towns working together for these things. This little example is just from Florence, Warsaw, and Utrecht in 2022. But, it stands for an awful lot of things going on around the world. And then, of course, there are the individuals and the grassroots of the world that is vitally important. That's who we are, where we live. Wherever there are people, there's environmental activism. There's a list. Everybody, can do this, and many millions of people are doing it, which is good. And as environmental dangers become more pressing and people realize them more, activism becomes more focused, more urgent, more capable, and better networked. And I believe that as the underlying mood, the mindset of humanity, if you like, shifts towards a closer to a Molong-mindedness type, progress on making peace with nature will accelerate. But it must be said that onslaught thinking remains attractive to many, and we can expect political turbulence as onslaught traditions, that is the habits of the last 600 years of ecocide, conquest, exploitation, are kind of defended and driven forward by especially the populist right. But politically, anyway, it's becoming quite turbulent. I'll say, yeah. So it's not going to be easy, in other words. But again, we come back to this idea that people work best in small groups. And in small groups, of course, individual commitments, individual talents, and individual inspiration become critical. So where my book is heading, and where I guess I'll be about to leave you, is the idea of a Peace with Nature pledge that people can take for their own motivations and satisfaction. I mean, this is sort of inspired by the Peace Pledge Union, which was set up in 1934, whose members renounce war and work against the causes of war. I think inspired by this, but a more practical pledge for peace with nature would, in which one would promise to live at peace with nature, one would act always in her defence, and one would help others to do so. It would also confer duties, though, to lead, to learn, to educate, and to organise, to research and expose environmental crimes, and to defend our achievements as we make progress. And out of that, you can imagine a world in which a shared vision for Scotland, the UK, and the world, in which all the main causes of war with nature are disabled, and where peace with nature is restored in the infinitely diverse ways required by the ecology of each locality, because all are so different, all are so diverse, and also the spirit or the Molong mindset of the people living there. So I'll leave you with a famous assertion by an anthropologist, Margaret Mead, who wrote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So thank you very much for your attention, and any questions?
Thank you very much, Julian. If you can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Then we show back and people can hear us. That was absolutely fascinating, and we're getting some applause across the screen. We have 150 people, a maximum 100 people who've been listening to this talk, and there'll be another 120 who have registered, who may see it again when it's put online onto the Trust website. We've had people from Montana to Poland, from Shetland, Arran, Bute, to the borders and back to the heart of the Lothians in Balerno and Livingston. We have about 13 questions here. So without more ado, I will use the voting system and the button system to try and get us through them. And I would like to start from Kirsty. Very early on, Kirsty asked, how does one cope with the anxiety of the weight of this knowledge? I feel like I can't do enough. And I thought that was great that Kirsty put that up there, because you hadn't even got going at that point. And your diagram showing the breaking of many boundaries, proposed boundaries, hadn't come up at that point. So how do we deal with the weight of this knowledge? You know, one's often heard of climate change, burnout, and the rest of it. How can this help us?
Well, my personal answer, I guess, is that I try and maintain a position of my spirit midway between pessimism and optimism, and I kind of keep it focused there by a sense of purpose. So essentially, regardless of whether it's hopeful or not, the fact is we have a purpose. We need to do stuff, and trying to and engaging with it is helpful. But we are humans, we are social, and engaging with other people is also is probably the best answer. I've found, for example, that working with the Wildlife Trust actually is quite reassuring, but also joining Extinction Rebellion regeneration sessions and sharing it, because everybody's scared, and by talking with others about the fear, you can make it a lot easier, and also you can then join and sort of help do something, engage locally. That's the way forward.
I feel better for that answer, Julian. Very good answer, thank you. No, that is very helpful. The next follow-on question is related from Maxine, was how do we motivate people at an individual level to both make change to the personal behaviour and demand action from politicians to make the kinds of changes needed? Maxine is concerned that people seem to be selfish, and how do we make them more, if you like, planetary aware, more needing the peace of the whole of nature?
Well, obviously sorry, no, not obviously. I don't know the answer to that. The only thing I know is just to keep is to become as best or communicate as best one can, and not don't get deterred. Just keep trying to communicate, really.
Which you're going to do with your book on this very topic.
Yeah, but I mean, we communicate in so many different ways. As I tried to talk about I'd mentioned poetry and art and things early on, precisely because you can make fantastic communicative statements with art and poems and films and photographs, and there are all these media, acting. There's all. And this is one of the great things about Extinction Rebellion actions on the streets is that they're hugely creative. There's all these artists doing things and keeping, So try and engage with everybody. Be polite. Be as well informed as you can be. Try your best and just keep on going. And I believe things are getting easier day by day, because ecological reality cannot be denied.
Thank you, Julian. And I'll just point out to some people that in the webinar chat, some other people have been supporting your answers with extra information, which is very kind of them. The next question I'm going to put to you is from Jane, I don't understand why there are so many new houses being built all around Scotland using green spaces and not using brown sites or reusing derelict old properties found in most towns and cities. It really doesn't feel the politicians care. What should we do about this? This is a question that I'm fully supportive of, because I'm planning secretary, and this is a major problem. We have excellent planning policies now in Scotland, but are they going to be enacted?
Yeah, I'm fully in favour of it too. I mean, my local MP, Ian Murray, is very keen on trying to get some sense into the kind of development, the rampant developments of housing estates with no infrastructure, no doctors' surgeries, no things. Yes, it's a big problem. I don't know. All you can do really is keep nagging the politicians because they're in charge.
Yes, nagging. That's our role as Scottish Wildlife Trust activists. To actually, most of the time, prod to politicians' policies and planning policies that they have, actually to do them. Okay, moving on. Very early on, we had a question from Gail, and she asked, could we improve nature's chances by empowering women's reproductive choices as a policy, besides protection, carbon capture, renewables, biodiversity targets, etc.? The global population might be leveling off, and I think that is one of your charts, but it is still unsustainable.
Well, none of my charts had a global human population on them.
No.
That was more decline of wildlife. But anyway, I think the rate of I've not been tracking it lately, but the rate of increase may be expecting to be going down. I think that everyone agrees that that there's well, I don't want to. It's a complex and taboo-ridden subject, reproductive matters. I think everyone agrees that the best way forward is probably to empower women everywhere all the time, and empowered with both various forms, actual power, but also knowledge and access to services and so forth, so they can become better able to express their own life ambitions, and that leads to smaller populations, or smaller families, which lead to lower population growth rates and greater prosperity for all, probably. But it's not a simple subject, and there are no simple answers, including from me, I'm afraid.
That's okay. Thank you. Now for something completely different, but from Jamie. Would it be okay to expand a bit more about the differences that Indigenous perspectives bring? Many Indigenous cultures who have a genuinely positive engagement with the rest of nature seem not to see themselves as exceptional and superior to everything else, as post-Enlightenment European thinking tends to. There's a lot of science now exploring non-human intelligence, which opens us up to a much more personal relationship with other organisms. Whoops, that's just screened off my screen. Can we really adopt a Murlong mindset without changing the stories we tell about nature? Can we really adopt a Murlong mindset without changing the stories we tell about nature?
Well, probably not, because you've got to care about nature in order to pay attention to nature and to want to understand her enough to obey her rules. And to care about it requires a degree of recognition that you're in a reciprocal, you're dependent upon her. So if we tell our story, if we in the West or the North or the global mainstream tell stories about the conquering of frontiers and opening and of bringing land under the plow, and that's all great. Well, it helps to keep us separate from nature. Yes, so the stories are vitally important. As far as wasn't sure if it was the same question, but the point about indigenous people, yeah, it's a very interesting one. I mean, someone once described Aboriginal Australia as being a continent occupied by hundreds of people, each of which were living in their own promised land. Essentially, it's exactly that each people has its own place, and there is no above, no one giving them orders. They are their own people. They share certain communications and cultural themes with other people nearby, but essentially there's no sense of one being superior to another. Yeah, so it's a very horizontal continent, and I think, broadly speaking, that's the case throughout the indigenous world, which was 75% of the world's land surface prior to 1420. Europeans, fundamentally, their history was such that they developed very vertical hierarchies and a lot of entitlement myths that encouraged them to feel themselves superior to others. And that kind of was part of the syndrome of driving the later expansion, I guess.
Was it also the fact that there were large populations in small areas, which goes back to these reproductive questions we've had earlier?
Well, people
wanted to spread out.
Well, there weren't that many Europeans at the time, I don't think. It was more that they saw the opportunities of, easy things.
Okay, moving on from Rochelle. Japan is the epicenter of silver therapy, forest therapy, designed to encourage the rediscovery of forests and revive traditions, and it is a legally protected preventative medicine. How can this be explored and gain awareness locally and globally? I must admit, I have heard of it here.
This is forest bathing, kind of.
Silver therapy, yes.
Oh, silver, as in trees. Yeah.
Forest therapy, yes.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I like it. I like the idea of it. I don't know what to do about it to encourage the thing, but
I think that I've heard of it and you've heard of it. It has spread from Japan to here, so the word is getting around.
Why can't it happen in the Scottish Wildlife Trust nature reserves? Sure. In the Lothians, for example.
We have lots of woodland groups for the young folk who use our woodland reserves. And that's really quite similar to that, I think. Okay, from Kenneth, is there any research you know of which has been done about specific countries with the highest rate of human population growth and the impact on wildlife numbers? Is there any research you know of which has been done about specific countries with the highest rate of human population growth and the impact on wildlife numbers? Where wildlife and high populations of humans are getting too close together, I guess that question is about.
Yeah, well, I don't know, I can't rattle off references, but I suspect that, I mean, people will have researched the matter, but as I said, the population density is bound to be controversial, and it's also very complicated because it's not really a question of just how many people there are, it's a question of what those people do, how they think, how they relate to nature. I mean, Japan has a high population density, but is extremely well forested, for example. Singapore is a high-density place and is very green. You know, it's not a simple system.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. What a question here from Cameron. Could artificial intelligence play a part in bringing the strands of making peace with nature together globally?
Well, a friend of mine in California actually asked ChatGTP, you know, something like how can we restore peace with nature in the world, and it spewed out a perfectly reasonable list of obvious things that I, you know, in my consulting job, I've been telling various governments to do for the last 20 years. You know, it's not that it's not that we don't know what we should be doing. It's just that we don't want to do it because we're not in the right mindset yet.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I'm just sorting out what is a question and what is a statement. And Alan asks, am I allowed to use this information? I presume he means when he sees the online copy of this talk, can he quote from some of your slides?
Of course.
Good, thank you. Thanks for asking, Alan. John asks, is there an app or website we can use to advise on all aspects of lifestyle so we can reduce our individual impact on the environment?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first?
I'll say it more so. Is there an app or website we can use to advise on all aspects of lifestyle so we can reduce our individual impact on the environment? I think.
Oh, I don't know of any one
you can
website.
recommend. There's probably lots, isn't there?
There are lots and lots and lots, and the whole thing
The one
is
you like?
the one I mean, where to start? You know, the United Nations. It depends. Can I think about that and post an answer somehow?
Well, Andrew put something on the chat and came up with the WWF carbon footprint calculator, which
Oh,
I
that sort
have
of
seen.
thing.
And that is a very good one. Thank you, Andrew. From Veronica, how can we stop garden centres selling peat-based compost when there are various alternatives? Peat is now being imported into the UK so we can grow begonias.
Yeah, well, as we know, the Wildlife Trust, it's a campaigning topic. It needs regulation, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean this year, many years ago, the Scottish Wildlife Trust put a lot of resources into this. I don't know if anybody. I noticed that the trust chair is here. Kenny Taylor is actually present. Was there legislation? Is there legislation? What you're saying is we need legislation to outlaw peat-based compost or make it much less used. When there is a proven alternative, that's what you're saying. When it can be shown that for the purpose it's required that there are proven alternatives. Now, I'm just checking. I've got several statements here, but they're not actually questions. So, did anybody else want to add a question or rephrase something they've made into a question on the Q&A, or have we done very well for the last 15 minutes? Julian has done well with these.
Well, I have to say it's all been very fascinating with getting this feedback, and I'm sorry.
There's a bit of feedback from Cameron. He says on his AI question, he says, I suppose I meant could AI be used to influence mindsets in terms of making peace with nature? I guess the more the right sort of stuff that comes back when you do an AI query, like your chat GPT, the more your book is published and becomes available on the web, etc., the more likely acceptable to you answers are going to come back.
Yeah, in principle, yes. There's something. This AI is such a powerful technology that I really we need a better answer than that.
Yes.
You know, we need to know how to use it really constructively to the limit of its capacity.
Okay. I've got another couple of questions. First of all, from Anne, what do you think of battery storage facilities?
Or battery for power, or battery for
Yes,
hens.
you know, this is for storing. This is large scale batteries for
Yeah, yeah.
storing the power from the windmills
Right.
offshore off Scotland.
Oh, yeah. No, well, yes, it's a rapidly evolving technology. I don't know what the current state of play is. They keep every few weeks there's a article in New Scientist or something about a completely new way of storing power. Who knows where it's all going to go?
Yeah. Yeah, there are planning problems with them, and they do tend to go on fire. But that has to be a short-term technological
Mm.
problem. We need them, don't we? We need them to capture this
Oh, yeah.
renewable energy, and so we can substitute it for other sorts. Right. I think I'm going to end by giving Kirsty the last word, because Kirsty asked the first question, and Kirsty's last question, which she's just put here, is, can I be cheeky and ask if there's a possibility of getting a signed copy of a book, please, Julian? So
Uh,
I would point out to Kirsty that you put your email address on the first slide of your talk, didn't you?
I did. For
So
the,
perhaps Kirsty will get that and can email you, and you can let her know when your book comes out.
I will do. Excellent.
Is there anything more you want to say about your book, Julian?
I think I've said well. Actually, I suppose I could say that I've had to skirt over a lot of stuff in this talk, which is going to be explored more and explained more fully in the book. So it'll probably make a lot more sense,
Yeah.
the book, than the talk does.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I'm glad you've got some usefulness out of the questions of the members here. So I'm going to thank you, Julian, for what I knew was going to be and was indeed an absolutely fascinating and wide-ranging talk in really quite a difficult and new area, or at least you're getting people to focus back into a new area that might have been looked at in the past, and it is very important. Thank you very much indeed for giving us this talk. Thanks to everybody for attending and for your contributions, and we will see you again online some other time. Good night, Julian, and thank you, Jill, for organising the technology.
Yes,
Good night,
thank you.
everyone.
Goodbye.